The AirTag Nightmare. Breakups are tough, even when they're for the best. After splitting with my boyfriend of 2.5 years, I was struggling to move on. We weren't right for each other anymore, but that didn't make it any easier. Some days, it felt like everything reminded me of him. One of the things I missed most was playing pool together. It was our thing. He was incredible at it, pulling off trick shots like it was nothing. I'm decent, but he was on another level. We'd spend hours at dive bars, laughing, competing, and just enjoying each other's company. A few weeks ago, I found myself missing that part of my life more than usual. It was a random Wednesday, and none of my friends were free. I didn't want to sit around the house feeling sorry for myself, so I decided to head out to one of the bars we used to go to. I told myself it wasn't about nostalgia, I just needed to get out. Believe me, I'm not the type of person to go out alone, but I was feeling some type of way that night. The bar was exactly the same as I remembered. Dim lighting, worn-out stools, and a jukebox in the corner. The familiarity was comforting, but it also stung. The memories came flooding back, and I almost turned around and left right then. But I forced myself to stay. After grabbing a few drinks, I wandered over to one of the pool tables and started idly chalking a cue. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do. Playing alone would have been a little odd. Luckily, a guy walked over. He was maybe in his mid-20s, the only person in the room even close to my age. He leaned against the table and asked if I was up for a game. I nodded and told him to rack them up. He put some money in the slot and started racking the balls. I laughed to myself as he racked them wrong, but I didn't say anything. We played a few rounds, and I started to relax. He wasn't bad, not as good as my ex, but not terrible. I wasn't going easy on him though. I won every rack we played. We chatted as we played, and he even bought me a couple of drinks. He was friendly enough, but it quickly became clear he wasn't the brightest guy in the world. I like sharp, quick-witted guys who can hold their own in a conversation. This guy, not so much. Still, I didn't mind. It felt good to just play and talk and not overthink things for once. I was having a good time. After the fourth game, he popped the question, "Do you want to go back to my place?" The question caught me off guard, but I guess I couldn't have been too shocked. I froze for a second before shaking my head. I tried to make it playful, saying he'd need a second date for that. In all honesty, I just didn't want to move so quickly. I guess I didn't do a good job turning him down, though, because his entire demeanor changed. His smile dropped, and he literally started scowling at me. I was not prepared for what happened next. He said, "Are you serious?" and grabbed my wrist, muttering something about spending all that money on drinks. Before I could respond, he snatched my purse too. I had never been in a situation like that, so instead of screaming or fighting, I just kind of froze up. Even though we were in a public place, I was still terrified. Luckily, a couple of older guys at the bar noticed what was happening and stepped in. I'm honestly not sure what I would have done had they not. One of them told the guy to let me go. The guy glared at me, muttered something under his breath, and threw my purse back onto the table before storming out of the bar. My heart was still racing as I thanked those guys profusely for helping me out. That was it for me, though. I called an Uber and left the bar, still kind of shocked and trying to process what had just happened. I decided to close my eyes in the Uber, and I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is the driver gently waking me up. We were parked across the street from my house. I thanked him, got out of the car, and started walking toward the door. As I rummaged through my bag for my keys, I impulsively checked my phone for the first time since leaving the bar. That's when I saw it, that god-awful notification, "AirTag found moving with you." I nearly dropped my phone. My hand started to shake as I rummaged through my purse, tossing aside my wallet and makeup until my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. I pulled it out and stared in disbelief. There was literally an AirTag in my bag. A wave of panic hit me, way worse than what I was feeling earlier. I was still standing in the middle of the street, so I threw it on the ground and stomped on it a bunch of times until I was sure it was broken. I fought back a scream and started breathing heavily. The cold wasn't helping. I needed to get inside. I looked around frantically, but the street was completely empty. Whoever had planted the AirTag, probably that guy from the bar, would know exactly where I was. Maybe not my exact house, but the street for sure. The houses on my street are large and spaced out, so he'd definitely be able to narrow it down. I grabbed my purse and sprinted to the back door, fumbling with the lock before finally getting inside. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I was safe, but I couldn't stop shaking. I walked up to my room, wondering how I had gotten myself into this mess. Normally, I'm asleep by 10 and out cold for 9 or 10 hours, but there was no way I was going to sleep that night. I looked out my bedroom window, thinking maybe the scenery would lull me to sleep or something. As I was looking out the window kind of mindlessly, I noticed an old, beat-up Lincoln driving slowly past my house. Nothing too unusual, but it was kind of late for cars to be driving on a residential road. But then it came back from the opposite direction, and I knew something was wrong. It passed even slower the second time, like the driver was scanning the houses. I didn't want to face the reality of the situation, but when it passed the third time, I had no choice. It was the guy. It had to be. He was trying to find my house. I wanted to scream again. The next time the car passed, the driver's side window was rolled halfway down. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't want that guy to know he was in the right area. I know that doesn't make any sense, but I was so scared and couldn't think straight. The next time the car passed, the driver's hand was hanging out of the window, holding something. It looked like a knife. And then, instead of driving past, the car stopped in the middle of the road, right across from my house. I ducked down, my heart beating a million beats a minute again. I stayed there, crouched below the window, too terrified to move. By the time I looked up, the car was gone. I waited for what must have been an hour, but it didn't come back. The next morning, I told my parents everything. My dad scolded me for not calling the police, but I told him I was too scared to. He called a buddy of his, a police chief, to ask for advice. His friend said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence or the car's plate number, which I hadn't been able to see. His friend told us to call the police immediately should we ever see that car again. I didn't leave the house for days. Even now, I'm really scared that he's waiting somewhere and he's going to see me enter or exit my house again. I haven't seen the car since though, so maybe the nightmare is over. The Intruder. I'm Kevin, a 40-year-old bartender at a high-end rooftop bar. I live a comfortable, if somewhat uneventful, life. I'm single, no kids, and I don't mind it. My job keeps me busy, and I enjoy the hustle and bustle of the bar scene. One Friday night, though, everything changed. The bar was packed, as usual, with groups of friends clinking glasses, couples on date nights, and a few folks who probably wandered in just to feel important. I was in my groove, mixing drinks and chatting with customers, when I noticed someone walk in who definitely looked out of place. I clocked the guy immediately. He was clenching his teeth and scowling like he was furious. He had jet black hair that wasn't combed and sat like a bird's nest on his forehead. He was wearing a blank black hoodie under a faded leather jacket, which looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. There were stains all over it, but none of that was as unsettling as his face. Like I said, he just looked so angry. He made a beeline for the bar but didn't sit down. He just stood there, staring at me. I wondered to myself how he had gotten past the doorman in the lobby. I cleared my throat and asked if I could get him something to drink, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the weird vibe he was giving off. He didn't answer right away, which was strange. He just kept glaring at me like he was getting ready to swing. Finally, he muttered that he wanted a double shot of Jaeger. I nodded, grabbed a glass, and poured the shot. Jaeger isn't a drink we pour often here. Most of our patrons are likely to ask for something a little higher quality. But hey, if someone wants Jaeger, I'm not about to question their taste. I set the glass in front of him and moved on to serve a few other patrons. When I came back to charge him, he tossed crumpled cash onto the counter. That also threw me off. Hardly anyone pays in cash at this place. Again though, it wasn't my place to judge. The guy didn't say anything as I rang him up, and I was ready to move on when he spoke again. I still remember his exact words. "I knew I'd find you here, Kevin." I froze. My eyes snapped to his as I scrambled to process what he just said. I put the glass in my hand down and demanded to know how he knew my name. I didn't want to make a scene, so I kept my voice low, but I hoped he got the gist of how serious I was. He didn't answer my question, just stared at me with the same angry intensity. Finally, he said, "I know what you did. Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked toward the elevators. I wanted to yell something or chase after him, but I decided against it. I was on the clock. I couldn't just neglect my job. Instead, I just stood there for a moment, completely thrown off. I was honest to God confused out of my mind. I didn't recognize him in the slightest. I couldn't think of anything I had done that would warrant such a cryptic statement. I'm no saint, but I don't go around making enemies. It put me in a sour mood for the rest of the night. When my shift finally ended, I drove home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened earlier. I racked my brain for literally any explanation that made sense but couldn't think of any. By the time I ended up going to bed, I was still relatively unsettled by the whole thing. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up randomly. I wasn't really sure what woke me up. I didn't have to go to the bathroom, and I'm usually the type of person to sleep through the night. I didn't hear or see anything, but something felt off. Without moving, I kept my eyes open, waiting for them to adjust to the darkness. After about a minute, I saw something that gave me an adrenaline rush of fear. There was a dark mass in the corner of my room, next to the door. It was just standing there, but I was 100% sure it was something that didn't belong in my room. I felt my heart start to race, but I forced myself to stay still, pretending to still be asleep. Someone was in my room. I repeated that thought to myself like 6 times before truly processing it. I knew I had to do something. I counted silently to 3, and in one quick motion, I sprung out of bed, screaming like a crazy person. I was prepared for a fight, but the figure didn't come toward me. Instead, he bolted for the door. As he moved, I heard something clatter to the floor. I chased after him through my house, but by the time I reached the front door, it was wide open, and whoever had been in my room was gone. I wanted to run out into the yard to look for him, but I was worried that I'd be walking directly into a trap. Instead, I made what I still think is the smart decision and slammed the door shut and locked it. I thought back to the clatter I had heard earlier in my room. I walked back to my bedroom, turned on the light, and froze. In the corner of the room, there was a knife just laying there on the floor. It was one of mine, taken from the kitchen. I felt sick. Whoever I had just chased was planning to hurt me, possibly kill me. I called the police right after that, and they quickly arrived and searched both my house and my yard but found nothing. I gave a description of the man from the bar, and the police got the video footage from my bar, but they haven't been able to find him yet, or at least, I haven't heard anything. The thing that freaks me out the most is that I know for a fact I had locked all my doors that night. I locked them every night. During their search, though, the police were never able to figure out how that man entered my house. None of the windows were broken or unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry. To this day, I still have no idea how he got inside. I haven't seen him since, but I would be lying if I said I don't think about this encounter often. The elderly couple. I work at a busy bar and restaurant in a suburb just outside Baltimore. The place has a unique setup. There are no waiters, just bartenders like me and the cooks in the back. If you want food or non-alcoholic drinks, you have to order them at the bar and grab them from the counter when they're ready. It's a fast-paced environment, and I love it. The place is always lively, with great music, a buzzing crowd, and a standing area near the DJ booth where people gather to dance and chat. One weekend night, the bar was packed with a younger, rowdier crowd. I was running around, mixing drinks and keeping up with the chaos, when I noticed an elderly couple walk in and sit down at a booth in the corner. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them. I just thought it was interesting that 2 people that age would want to come into a rowdy place like this. I didn't have too much time to think about it though, so I went back to work. Fast forward maybe 30 minutes to an hour, and I noticed the couple again. My hands kept working, muscle memory taking over, but my brain was stuck on them for some reason. That's when it hit me, they were just sitting there, motionless. They hadn't ordered anything, no food, and definitely not any drinks. I would have remembered. I looked a little closer and realized that they weren't even looking at each other. They were both fixated on the wall next to them. From what I could tell, it didn't look like they were talking either. It was the strangest thing. The footprints in the snow. For over 7 years, my fiancé and I have lived in my childhood home, an old brick house nestled deep in the woods. The property borders a massive forest, and while I've always loved the isolation, something strange started happening shortly after we moved in. It began one winter morning when I noticed a trail of barefoot footprints in the snow. They led from the woods to my car and back, as if someone had walked directly to my vehicle and then retreated. I was baffled. My fiancée hadn't made them, and no one else should have been out there. I brushed it off, thinking it might have been an animal, but the prints looked unmistakably human. A few years later, in 2015, it happened again, this time on a much larger scale. The entire yard was covered in barefoot prints. They circled the house, approached the windows, and even led to my shed, where tools had gone missing. I was shaken but tried to stay calm. My fiancée was terrified, and I knew I had to do something. Armed with my rifle, I followed the trail into the woods, but it split into two paths, as if there were multiple people. I turned back, unsure of what I was dealing with. The police were no help. Without evidence of a crime, they couldn't do much. We tried to move on, but the memory of those footprints haunted us. Then, in January of this year, it happened again. The footprints returned, and more tools were stolen. This time, I called my friend Theo, an experienced hunter, to help me track whoever was responsible. We ventured deep into the woods, following the trail until it split again. Theo had a thermal scope, and after hours of tracking, we saw something horrifying: 4 figures huddled in the snow. 2 were large and hunched over, while the smaller ones clung to a tree. They were naked, eating something, and their movements were unnatural. We hid until they disappeared into the woods. The police searched the area the next day but found nothing. My fiancée and I are now considering moving. We don't know who or what those figures were, but we can't keep living like this. The Pacific Crest Trail Nightmare. Last summer, I decided to hike a section of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've always loved solo hiking, but this trip turned into a nightmare. The first few days were fine, but on the third night, I woke up with a strange feeling that something was wrong. I discovered my wallet was missing. Over the next few days, more items disappeared: lighters, knives, energy bars. Someone was stalking me. The paranoia set in. I started hallucinating, hearing footsteps, seeing shadows, even stepping into imaginary puddles. One night, I heard someone walking around my campsite. I grabbed my rifle but was too scared to confront them. The next morning, I decided to hike through the night to reach my car. As I walked in the dark, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw a figure dart behind a tree. When I aimed my rifle and shouted, the man stepped forward. He was wearing my missing shorts, his skin scratched and his face covered in hair. He lunged at me, and I fired a warning shot. He fled into the woods, and I ran to my car. I haven't gone hiking since. The hallucinations and the encounter with that man still haunt me. If you're planning to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, be cautious, and maybe don't go alone. The Logger's Terror. My best friend's dad was a logger in the Pacific Northwest. He and his co-worker, Griffin, were assigned to a remote job site high in the mountains. The area was so isolated it took weeks just to clear a road for their equipment. One day, they started hearing strange chatter over their radios. The voices were muffled at first but grew clearer over time. They also found signs of previous visitors, footprints, makeshift campsites, and a hidden tent. Inside the tent, they discovered disturbing items: children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and sketches of children being molested. The radio chatter continued, and one night, my friend's dad confronted the men over the radio. There was silence, and the next night, someone tried to break into their camper. 2 men attacked them, slashing my friend's dad across the face with a knife. Griffin fought them off, and the men fled into the woods. They reported the attack, but nothing came of it. 2 weeks later, a co-worker was found raped and murdered. No arrests were ever made. My friend's dad still struggles with PTSD, and the experience has left me terrified of the deep woods.